So, good morning, everybody. I'm so happy that you're all here for this Bagel U presentation with Toni Miller, who went to Goucher College and got her Master's of Literature at Case Western Reserve University. She, for many, many, many years, I think decades, led living room learning classes and great books groups, and has been a voracious reader her whole life, often reading a novel a night. And with that, I'm going to present my mother, Toni Miller.
For being here.
Oh, Mom, can you speak a little louder?
Oh, no. I'll do this.
Okay.
And all the emails on this machine are coming in, but I don't think they're.
You can ignore them. Yeah.
Thank you for joining me, and thank you, Abraham, for setting up this challenge for me. I never heard of Chaim Grade until you brought him to my attention. And now my bucket list includes reading all of his 20 novels as soon as I get hold of them in English translation, because he was a Lithuanian Yiddish writer.
Back later.
Oh, can everyone else mute themselves, please? Or I'll mute you. Could everyone please mute themselves?
Bye-bye.
Judy, we hear you. If you could mute yourself, please. Okay, go ahead.
Grade was born in 1910 in Vilna, Lithuania, and he died in 1982. I knew nothing about him, and part of that is to be explained in something else that Abraham Lisa shared with me, a New York Times article about Grade that explained why he wasn't as well known as Isaac Bashevis Singer or Sholom Aleichem. It's a long story. But Grade wrote poetry and 20 novels and memoirs from after World War I until his death in 1982, recreating Eastern Europe that disappeared during the wars. And he spent a decade as a yeshiva student and then turned to his writing and to her secular life. And all of that appears in his writing, every single book. I spent a month searching to obtain books in translation. It was very hard. And Cleveland has wonderful library systems. There's a major metropolitan system with about 50 branches and a suburban system with at least 50 branches. And suburban didn't have any, and the city system had 4 books of Grade in English, and it took a month to get them. So it built up my appetite to get started. And, I ended up devouring them. And when I attempted to buy translations of the rest of his books, I went to Amazon and eBay and Abe's books, and I found some copies of the other books that I wasn't able to obtain, but they were either $80 or $800. So it shows the rarity of these on Earth. I will search in the libraries a little more after this talk, because it's really my bucket list to read all of his books, because he did such a magnificent job of recording what he saw and what he felt before and during and after the war. Fled to the Soviet Union at the start of World War II under the impression that able-bodied men were the target of the Nazi invaders. After the war, he returned to Vilna and found that his wife and his mother had died and the whole area had been destroyed. And this fueled his desire to offer up the past for the world to see. His second wife, Hanahar, attempted to translate his books into English after his death. She died in 2010 at the age of 85. That is the background before I get to the books. I was excited to find 4 of Brade's books to read, but wasn't sure what I would think about them. So I decided to read them in order of length, from shortest to lengthiest. And the Agana was the novel that introduced me to Brade's writing. Oh no, they're out of order. Okay, so this ended up being a real education for me because they're steeped in Orthodox practices, and I only knew the tip of the iceberg, but these go into great length. The main character in the Agana is Merle, a seamstress, and she was vivacious and attractive and enthusiastic as she was growing up and was surrounded by suitors. And she married at age 19, Itzhak. They were affectionate and close to one another, but he was called into the Lithuanian service and was in the military right when the war started, and his whole unit was destroyed and obliterated in the first military endeavor that they faced. So maybe there were a couple of survivors who told of what happened, but no one else returned. Merle threw herself into her career, her seamstress work, for the meaning that it gave her life and for the support of her family, because her mother needed to go to a nursing home and her 2 sisters had married lazy, drunken husbands. So she was supporting them and 2 nieces, and it gave her a lot of purpose. Most of the other widows started remarrying, but they did so in secular circumstances. And she decided that if she ever met someone and felt like remarrying, she would marry in a secular setting as well. But she kept busy with her work, and 16 years went by since the time of the death of the soldiers and her husband. And one of her girlfriends died, and she went to a ceremony at a cemetery. And the other girlfriends were saying, you really ought to remarry and stave off loneliness. And she said, well, I'll think about it, but I'm plenty busy. But there was a cemetery cantor who overheard this conversation and realized that she was single. And he started paying attention to her, and they talked about marriage. And he said, have you consulted a rabbi about your standing? And she said, no, she never did that. But she went to the rabbi in Vilna that concentrated on Agunot. And he said, since there was no witness to her husband's death, that she couldn't remarry because he might have chosen to take up with someone in the country he was in fighting and then reappear in Vilna, and she would be a bigamist if she married someone else. So he couldn't permit it. Well, her suitor, Kalman Maytes, the cantor, wanted a second opinion. And there was a young rabbi in town who hadn't been accepted by the rabbinic council because he had bent some rules. He hadn't been so fundamental with the rules of the Torah. And he had allowed people to carry money on the Sabbath and did it to help refugee children so that the money could be deposited in a fund, and it was for a good cause, but it tore people apart. And so he was on the outskirts and was really a merchant and not he was concentrating on his studies, but not with a pulpit. But they consulted him, and he felt compassion for the Aguna, her situation, and he found a code that allowed her to marry. And so Merle and Kalman married. But that's when things really lit up in the whole community, because it was the Orthodox and the progressive points of view that just got wilder and firmer. And this cemetery cantor wasn't allowed to officiate at any services because he had broken an important law. And he was also a house painter, but it was during the war and no one was using his services. So he got very despondent. And Merle was even thinking that she might divorce him because it was unpleasant to live with, and they were causing so much disturbance in the whole community. Well, I won't spoil the ending and the way that Grade created such drama, but it is very gripping, and it shows Grade's ability to represent so many types of people that he lived around and create them in a literary form. So that is what I'll say about the Aguna. The next book in length was The Rabbi and Wives. And this was a collection of 3 novella. And they really dealt with some of the same subjects of different points of view religiously. There were 2 books two of these short books that I particularly wanted to deal with. One was Leva Lazar's Courtyard, and I wanted to show you examples.
Mom, I'm sorry to interrupt you. Could you lift up your head a little bit? Because when you look down, we lose your sound. Thanks.
Oh,
Or
okay.
just lift your notes up or something. Thanks.
All right. All right. So if you would put those examples of the ones starting with on the first night of Shavuot, Do you have that? Okay. I thought I would get it started because it shows the demographics of the village and what people were engrossed in and how they interacted. On the first night of Shavuot, the lamps in the bed midrash and the candelabra were still lit past midnight. The benches were packed with men from the courtyard and from the neighboring streets, who, as was the custom on this night, came to study until dawn. Sitting in his usual place, Reb Hesketh was engrossed in the tikkun, the traditional test for this night of study. Text. He had enough verses from the scripture and selections from Midrash to last the whole night. At the front table, between the bima and the ark, sat a group of men, and at the head of the table was Rabbi Yoel Weintraub conducting a class in the book of Ruth and its rabbinic commentaries. Before I continue, I'll explain that the Reb, who had so much to prepare, was very fundamental in his approach to religion with no give and take. And the Rabbi Weintraub had a congregation in a small village of Lithuania, but he felt that he was just telling people that things were forbidden all the time, and he was uncomfortable with his role of supporting laws that made life so difficult for people. So he left the rabbinate, but he came to Vilna and he went to a Beit Midrash to study every day, and his wife started selling eggs to support them because he wasn't in a position to be recommended for a congregation since he didn't follow the rules so strictly. Continue the reading after that rabbinical commentary and read a couple of, or read a paragraph.
Could we have a volunteer, please? Unmute yourself.
Sure.
Okay.
On this night, the Parush had a fresh, strong voice and clear, rested eyes. His broad gray beard, streaked with strands of brown, shone as it lay on the collar of his talit katan. And his broad hands shone also as they lay on the huge pages of the Midrash Rabbah, opened in front of him. The Parush loved the book of Ruth, where there are no chastisements, no prophetic doomsaying, only words of comfort, trust, and love in every verse. Though not a great orator, he was not for a moment at a loss for words in describing the wisdom and the noble ways of Ruth the Moabite, of her mother-in-law Naomi, and their relative Boaz. It was just these qualities that made the saintly, God-fearing convert Ruth and her second husband Boaz worthy of being the ancestors of King David. And so it is, he explained, that the book of Ruth is read on the second day of Shavuot, the anniversary of the death of the King David of blessed memory.
Thank you. Now will someone read the next paragraph? Okay. But this gives.
Yeah, someone will volunteer.
I can read, Rabbi. It's Miriam.
Okay.
The men crowded around the table. The men crowded around the table were poor retail merchants in plain cloth hats and worn, smudged, long frock coats. There were also artisans with thin little beards, their wrinkled, labor-swollen fingers covered with calluses and prickly hair. Today, however, even the poorest looked their best in honor of the holiday, and their eyes reflected the reddish flicker of the candles in their houses and the blazing lamps in the Beit Midrash. Their limbs were still heavy with leaden fatigue from the frantic last-minute business of the afternoon before Shavuot, and yet they felt somewhat refreshed by the wine of the evening Kiddush prayer that ushered in the tasty holiday dinner, and by the short nap they had taken before going to the Beit Midrash for the night. They sat or stood, shoulder to shoulder, around the table as they listened to the Porish's inspired words, swaying ever so slightly and humming to themselves the sweet cantillation of the Book of Ruth, which would be read at morning services the day after next.
You. That's it for that, Diana. I think. Oh no, I guess not. Well, will someone read this last paragraph at the very front of the Beit Midrash?
I can read it.
Okay.
At the very front of the Beit Midrash, on either side of the ark, behind the heavy oak lecterns, sat the milk-white old men. All year long they were treated as senile, and they felt superfluous in their children's homes, and guilty for taking up space. So these elders sought sanctuary in the Beit Midrash, where they struggled with the small print in a Talmudic volume through a magnifying glass that shook in their unsteady fingers or through 2 pairs of glasses. Only at the Passover Seder, at the beginning of the Yom Kippur feast, and during night-long sessions like this one, did the younger men look fondly at these patriarchs and shout into their ears, "Grandfather, may you live and be well until next year, when we'll wish it to you again."
And it gives us an indication of how clear and observant Grado was in seeing the people around him and recreating them on the page. There was one short section that I thought might be interesting. During the summery days of late Tammuz and early Av, even the summery days refused to join in the mourning for the temple. The peddlers of the Jewish street stood with blankets brimming with fresh vegetables, white heads of cabbage and cauliflower, eggplants and satiny dark purple skins, lacy heads of dill, bundles of onions, and freshly dug potatoes. Beckoning from the fruit baskets on the wooden stands were meat plums and honey-sweet yellow apricots. It seemed as if those wooden stands and into the woven baskets of the poor women peddlers had rolled countless small round suns, a treasure of golden ducats. The passers-by were all buying, each according to his means, even the old men going in and out at the courtyard gate, to and from services in the Beit Midrash, carried small paper bags in which were half or quarter pounds of one fruit or another. They mumbled the Shehechianu and slipped the sweet fruit between their beards and mustaches, forgetting or only pretending to forget that new fruit may not be eaten during the period just before Tisha B'Av. So this is really a world that I didn't know, and I am grateful to know it somewhat now. There's another novella in this book called The Oath, and it deals with the wheat merchant Shlomo Zalman Rappaport. He has been declared very sick by his doctors. He had a heart attack, and the doctors really feel that he's not going to survive and advise him not to have visitors or to talk at all, just to give himself some comfort and peace, but he wants to say goodbye to his friends, and he also wants to set a course for his son and daughter and wife. He recommends that his wife consult with his rabbi for any counsel that she needs. But the son has been in hopes of becoming an agricultural specialist and being a landowner as his father was, and the daughter, and so he tells the son to drop out of the secular university he's attending to learn his agricultural background and become a yeshiva student and study with the family rabbi. The daughter is dating someone, but he's telling the daughter that she should marry a yeshiva student. So he makes them, or hopes that they will take an oath to be true to his values. And that sets the background for that story. He dies a week after giving this counsel to his family members, and there were pages describing the groups of people who came to pay him honor at the service. So would you turn to those pages, Diana? And will someone read, starting with this first paragraph, the large throng?
I'll read, Abraham. The large throng that attended the wheat merchant's funeral came from many quarters. Since he had been born in Lithuania Hasidim and attended a Hasidic Beth Midrash every Sabbath, a large contingent came from the small Hasidic shtetls in the courtyard, from the Kadanova to the Stalin, the Lachovis, and of course the Shlonim. But just because they lived in Lithuania and so were constantly surrounded by Miknagdim, his Hasidim had grown less fervent in their devotion to the Rebbe and no longer journeyed to see him, but waited instead for his emissaries to come to them for financial support. On joyous occasion or at funerals, the sea is billowing black frocks, the wind-swept beards, and the fire that burned in the upturned eyes reminded the world that these Jews were yet Hasidim. Standing apart in a circle of their own were the Lubavitcher Hasidim from White Russia, their every movement betraying their fierce zeal, their stubborn determination, their fanatical loyalty to the Rebbe, the arrogance and the contempt for the world. And another group, the affluent congregants of the Grand Synagogue of Vilna, surrounding the town's rabbis. Sedate Talmudic scholars in long black overcoats and stiff black hair, their sidelocks neatly twirled and tucked behind their scholarly glances from behind their glasses, and the lines on their parchment white face told of cloistered lives lived within the 4 cubits of the writing response by night, as thick shadows crept across Beth Midrash walls. Shlomo Zalman Rappaport had dealt with many a Jew, befriended many others, and through a Hasid had been on friendly terms even with the free-thinking Maskilim. Members of the choral synagogue also came. Pharmacists, building managers, self-styled legal consultants, a crowd wearing rubber shirt collars and yellowed cuffs, their wrinkled faces clean-shaven to the point of being blue. From Shalweska and Rodnika streets came the cloth manufacturers with their short, pointed little beards and elegant coats, long and wide, made of the finest cloth.
Mom, do you want him to keep going or pause? Mom? Tony?
That's enough of a sampling of the people who surrounded him and that Grade was able to write about. There was something that I wanted to read. Now, this was the son who had left his school and all his ambitions of his profession and was studying with a rabbi who was very strict with him, and he was very resentful of the oath that he had taken for his father's satisfaction. And so he was distracting himself by looking outside of the lessons with the rabbi. Here's a paragraph that I thought shows Grade's powers. By the store's doorway during the summer, there stood baskets of fruit at which Gabriel, the son, gazed with sad longing. The fruit seemed to him like a joyous greeting from the fields and forests, and he could gauge the time of the season by the kinds of fruit in the baskets. The blackberry season was long since past, and so was the season for red raspberries and the hard green gooseberries. The transparent white currants had also disappeared, and the yellow honey-sweet cherries and the soft, mirror-smooth black cherries became rare visitors. Now juicy ripe plums beckoned him with their dark purple skins and deep red fleshy bodies. The vegetable gardens were having their say, too. The first young potatoes with their cherubic rosy skins were soon
Okay, I'm done.
large bulbous potatoes, radishes with notched heads as tough as bark, sparkling white heads of cabbage, and green cucumbers, thin and twisted, some wide and swollen. Next to last year's wreaths of onions lying on the wooden stands in their thin brown skins, this year's fresh green ones winked with their long white heads crowned by their stubby roots. Each time Reb Abraham Abba raised his eyes from his book and looked out the open door at the fruits and vegetables outside, he would once again reflect that only he who makes a blessing over the fruit and knows that nothing grows by itself has the double joy of the blessing as well as the fruit. So I think Grade was onto something. It was just so powerful. Maybe this is a good time to bring the New York Times article. Can you put that up? Abraham pointed me towards something that my computer wouldn't accept because it said I've used up all my time on the New York Times, but Diana found a way to find this article.
Excuse me, while I have many things open on my computer, so I'm finding it. While I'm looking for it, do you want to talk about the types of people, the recognizable types you were going to talk about?
Well, I was just saying that the style that Grade had is universal and it's understandable by everyone. It's very accessible. And he writes in contrast to be more inclusive. And he wrote about the religious and the secular, men's attitudes and women's attitudes, elderly and upstarts, quiet and outspoken, conservative and cutting edge, democratic, authoritarian, moral, corrupt, stable, unstable, well, unhealthy, individual, crowds, established and insecure, energetic and lyrical, bright and dark. His writing encompassed so many extremes, but people can identify whole and disintegrating, orderly and disorderly, serious and light, traditional, modern, optimistic, and doubtful. There's a little bit of everything on earth within the writings. So this article appeared in the New York Times, March 6, 2023, written by Joseph Berger, and the title, "In the Papers of Yiddish Novelist Chaim Grade, Clues to His Lesser Fame." And Diana can show the pictures of him,
This is his wife from 1975.
his second wife. They married in 1945, and I will get to what happened with his first wife when I talk about another book. But he had a loving relationship with Aleichem.Grade, his second wife, but they were also damaging to one another. They both had affairs, and they had a competition going between their writing efforts. And she was very jealous of his writing. There weren't many examples of her writing, but she spoke English and he didn't. And she was dealing with the publishers and not encouraging them to publish his works because it put her on a back burner. She was 15 years younger than Grade, and after he died, he spent time translating his works into English, and it was almost her annuity because anything that got published really got published after his death, because she kept his reputation from being spread. But they did show one another affection, but it was in a very tense situation. And this article deals with all of that.
But you can see the little Yiddish, the little Yiddish letters on his typewriter, if you look closely.
Would they also be Hebrew? I mean, they were.
Yeah, that'd be. Mm-hmm. I think that was it for the article.
I did have the one book, the Yeshiva, which I read. It was the third in the growing length of the books, and it dealt again with a traditional rabbi and a progressive one throughout the length of that book. It is definitely something to read, but I'll not deal with the details. Of the 4 books that I was able to obtain in English, Grade's memoir, My Mother's Sabbath Days, was the most powerful of all to me. And it's filled with the actions that he took and the people he knew and knew of before, during, and after the war. And this was fact. With all that's going in the world right now, I could not reread the book. It was just so devastating, all the loss and the grief. But it's just miraculous that he was able to put this on the page and let people see what life was like before all these shtetls disappeared and the people in them, he returned from escaping to Russia and found that his wife and his mother had died and his whole surroundings had been torn down. But he found a purpose in recreating those scenes for other people to understand what had been taken from the world. Maybe if you would show that 4-minute that you discovered, and there was a video by a Yiddish scholar at Harvard, an America professor, Ruth Wista, and she discussed Chaim Grade's use of conflict in his writing, and I think that can be illustrative of what he created.
Once I start playing, please give me a thumbs up if you can both hear it and see it, okay?
I think one of the things that Grade undertook to do in his own way was to recreate the world that was no more. And it's interesting that whereas for most people, one would think, recreate the world that is no more, that must be an elegiac task. Grade went exactly in the other direction. He understood, I think, and given the kind of person he was, he would have had to understand that life is conflict. Life is conflict. And if you really want to make the past come alive, the only way you can make it come alive is through conflict. And so he wrote these novels in which there are very gnarled personalities, in which there is a tremendous amount of conflict. And I think that the more powerful of his novels are the ones in which some of those conflicts come most alive and are most dramatically represented. For example, his best known story would be a post-war story of My Quarrel with Herr Schrassener. So there you have it right in the title, Mein Krieg, my war with Herr Schrassener. Not my quarrel, but my war with Herr Schrassener. And in a few lines, he evokes for us that this quarrel with Herr Schrassener, who was a member of the same yeshiva, Musar yeshiva, in which he, Chaim Grade, had studied, his quarrel goes back to their beginnings of their friendship, because each represented for the other the danger. Herr Schrassener remains a yeshiva boy, and when he sees that Chaim Grade leaves the yeshiva to become a writer, he hates him. He denounces him for that. And Chaim Grade has no use for this kid who remains in the yeshiva in a world that he has no more use for. Well, then they meet later after the war. And what happens? They resume their quarrel. Now that is Grade's tremendous insight. They resume their quarrel. What does that tell us? Just in its form, what it tells us is, yes, what came in between was everything. It destroyed Herr Schrassener's whole family. It destroyed the whole world of Vilna from which they both derived. It destroyed Chaim Grade's family. They will never be the same again. They meet in Paris. They will never be back to where they were again. But nothing could change the nature of that quarrel. And it's the quarrel that keeps them engaged with one another. And it's the quarrel that remains the quarrel in modern Jewish life. Which way should it go? And in a sense, it says that experience, which you think was the experience, which was the chasm that stands between everything that was and everything that is, in the story is eclipsed, right? Yes, the chasm is there, but it is eclipsed because the quarrel picks up basically where it left off, and it becomes, of course, much more intense. Now contains within itself the experience of these two men, but the experience of each of them has been felt according to who he was before the war.
Thank you. Thank you. Diana, could you call up the video showing Chaim Grade giving the talk? He's giving the talk in Yiddish, but there are super titles. So we'll play a little of this and let you see him and hear him in action. It's a 9.5-minute video, so we won't play all of it.
Probably
But-
just 2 or 3 minutes. (1958) in Montreal.
Jüdische Literatur aufgetan, noch ein Tanach, noch ein Talmud, noch die Medrashim, noch ein Rambam und sein Zeit, die Philosophen und Poeten. Was haben sie beigebracht? Liebe Freunde, die jüdische Literatur ist ein Hemmscher, sei von Chassidus und sei von der Haskole. Im letzten Sachaku hat Chassidus verfolgt, hat reingetragen im jüdischen Leben an ungeheurer Sachvolksstimmlichkeit. Die Teure ist auch abgegangen von dem größten Talmud Chochems Ständer und sie ist rein in Gemüt und in Herz von jedem Poschet und Volkslied und der Rebbe, der Chassidischer, hat ihm erzählt am Meise. Und auch viele die Teure, was hat gesagt in einer volksstimmlichen Läufen. Die Haskole hat reingetragen Weltlichkeit in jüdischen Leben. Sie hat gelernt, das jüdische Leben sich zu verweltlichen. Die jüdische Literatur ist ein Hemmscher von Chassidus in ihrer Volksstimmlichkeit. Die jüdische Literatur ist ein Hemmscher von der Haskole in ihrer Weltlichkeit. Was ist in der Hauptaufruf von der chassidischen Bewegung die Vorgehung von der jüdischen Literatur? Ich halte, als noch alle Werke, was sie geschrieben geworden, wenn Chassidus und Halten hingeschrieben werden, hat die beste Formulierung vor dem Geist von Chassidus gegeben, Tage Yal Peretz allein. In dem ersten Akt von der Golden Arcade, wo der Rebbe Schleime will nicht machen, kein Havdole. Die chassidische Teure, der Best und seine Norgeher, seien gekommen zu reinführen in jüdischen Leben, 7 Tage in der Woche soll sein Schabbes. Sie haben gelernt, his Pastus Hagashmias. Der Mensch soll sich rüsten von seinem Körper und schweben in den Himmel, als es wird erzählt in der Nacht, als Elio, wenn rauf von Himmel, hat abgeworfen von sich sein Mantel, als soll der Eid in alle Tage von der Woche abwerfen von sich seine Wochendigkeit und sein in dem Yom Shekule Shabbos, in dem Tag von dem ewigen Shabbos.
I'm going to read one section. It was from the oath, but it ties in with Grade's feelings about spirituality. On the Sabbath of the blessing of the new moon, Batsheva, the widow of Shlomo Rappaport, looked out, stationed in the far corner of the Beit Midrash near the bima, looking so poor and insignificant in a worn prayer shawl and a plain cap instead of a proper rabbinic hat. She was looking, I skipped a line, Batsheva looked out from the women's section and saw the Rebbe Abraham Abba looking so insignificant. He did not lift his eyes, even for an instant, from the tattered pages of his thick siddur, as if he knew no part of the prayers by heart, and he seemed so withdrawn that one might have thought his sole desire was to take up as little space as possible. Later at home, Batsheva voiced her complaint. If he refused to conduct himself with greater dignity, he should at least not make himself smaller than the men who sat up front. He was too anxious to run away from honor. He was simply too humble. And the Abraham Abba says, "You are wrong. I am not at all humble. I feel wherever I sit is the front of the Beit Midrash." He joked. But then he became very serious and began to share with her the innermost thoughts that had been simmering within him for many years. A person who runs after honor is one who does not believe in himself at all. His heart is restless and empty, like an old, dried up wooden barrel whose metal hoops have rusted and whose staves have rotted. This barrel wants to be mended and filled with the liquid of honor, with glory and admiration. But the seeker of glory cannot escape his true self. Wherever he will go and whatever he will do or say, everywhere and always, his pride pulls violently at every fiber of his being, as if he were lying in the bed of Sodom. Whereas one who learns Torah in earnest and with pure motives considers himself small, very small, but also great in his own eyes, very great. Whenever one looks at the sea or at the tall mountains, he always feels small because he feels dwarfed by the grandeur of nature. But when a man lives with Torah, which is greater, more majestic than the greatest sea and the tallest mountains, he cannot help feeling small. Man is as great as he is able to understand the Torah and the ways of the Almighty. I wanted to conclude with a study of a noted psychiatrist in a book just published. The author, now 97, has devoted his career to explaining the anguish that follows trauma. And here is what Robert J. Lifton has stated in this book entitled Surviving Our Catastrophes, because to me, this explains so much of where Grade got his power and his determination, and is such an inspiration to us, the way he is able to create. It doesn't explain his talent, but it may explain where he got the intention to go on. We humans, quoting the psychiatrist, we humans are meaning-hungry creatures. And, sorry, I need to get some glasses. Oh, okay. All right, we're meaning-hungry creatures, and survivors are particularly starved for meaning that can help them explain their ordeal. Only by finding such meaning can they tell their story and begin to cope with grief and loss. Sharing their stories with one another allows them to build new bonds and rebuild old ones. And they gradually shed the identity of passive victims and begin to reconceive themselves as survivors whose discovery of purpose or meaning allows, even propels them to re-engage with life, countering the senselessness of tragedy with a sense of mission. And so this psychiatrist, Dr. Lifton, says, choose witnessing and survival over the deadly impact of denial. A society must recognize the reality of a catastrophe in order to cope with it. So I thank you for joining me in this exploration of the works of Chaim Grade. And now I have 16 more novels to find.
I wanted to thank you, but I actually want to make a comment and also then see if other people want to make a comment.
Yes.
One comment, an observation I made from really taking this all in is how brilliant it's so within the Jewish tradition. I think about how we no longer have the temple, we no longer have the sacrifices, and yet we continue reading about them in the Mishnah and the Talmud, and even kind of perform them during Yom Kippur with the Avodah service. How he takes a world that ceased to exist, and yet with his creativity makes it a survival of strategy, like the rabbis did after the destruction of the temple, and puts it into words and creates a literature. And how in a way he also makes that continuity from Hasidic literature to Yiddish literature more clear, that there's something about the way that the Hasidic literature was more in often story form, or the way the Rebbe's would, transmit it to their disciples, than, let's say, Talmudic models, and how he made that connection that Yiddish literature, even though it was informed by Haskalah and the secular life in some way, it still was a continuity from the Hasidic tradition. And I just really appreciated the richness of his language. Yeah. And I'm also very interested in reading more. Thank you. Abraham, I saw your hand up.
Yes. First of all, thank you so much. This is absolutely wonderful. I have a couple of observations and comments. Cher and I read most of Rabbis and Wives. Actually, I had been introduced several years earlier by a Rabbi, Jim Diamond, the name of Grade, and I paid attention, and it wasn't until I saw that article in the New York Times that I thought this should be a program. But one of the things that I wanted to identify, at least for me, is in his style, not only this amazing description, scene setting, was chapter to chapter kind of dramatic tension that in each case does a twist, and then you anticipate the next chapter. It's very much like shtetls. It's very much like that there's going to be a continuation of the drama. It's not going to be the same, and each chapter can hold its own. There's that kind of deep drama. Now, the other thing I wanted to mention was in seeing Ruth Wissy's comment, by the way, she's absolutely brilliant. The business of conflict as being the meat of writing. That whole tension from that time of those Jews who were exposed to the Enlightenment, the Nishnagim versus the Hasidim, that world just collided. And that's very much alive today. Rabbi Mordecai Kaplan is part of that whole scene, and how there's a new way to look at things, but it's very much in conflict with the old way of looking at things. And that drama lives with us today.
David, and then Betsy. Oh, unmute yourself, David, please. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. That was marvelous. And I wanted to follow up a little what Abraham said, but the video with Ruth Wiss, I had read the short story, My Quarrel with Hirsch Rassheimer, and it's an amazing story. And her introduction is also extraordinary to it. And it is available, and I would say that it's about 50 or 60 pages, but her introduction to his work is amazing. And the story is extraordinary for reasons that Abraham suggests, of this tension and conflict that he builds through the story, of the argument of tradition versus secular and modern. And it really does lay the groundwork for an analysis of Mordecai Kaplan's work too, so brilliantly. So I've mentioned that, but thank you. You've excited all of our appetites to read more.
Betsy.
Thank you, Tony. I love your challenge of wanting to read all his books. And I can relate to the fact that if I have a lot of books, I do choose the one with the fewer pages and work up. So I relate to that. The thing is, I've been looking on Amazon, and as you said, it's hard to get these books that aren't like $100. So where did you get these? How did you read them? Where did you find them?
The Cleveland library system. But
They really have these books?
they had the 4 that I found, none beyond that. And those were available for sale at reasonable prices. So they must be the most circulating of his books. I didn't find the one that David read, and I hope that I can find that.
Yeah.
But some of the other, I have the whole list of the novels that he wrote, and I'm not sure if they've all been translated into English.
Yeah, I'm really interested in reading the Aguna.
Yeah.
Possible to find. So to go to the library, and maybe Philadelphia, or maybe synagogue libraries might receive them as donations from
Princeton
Princeton
book sale.
I have Rabbis and Wives, and I think I got that on 8 books.
8 books, okay.
And it wasn't expensive, I mean, as I recall.
Great. When?
I didn't hear what you said, Abraham.
Oh,
I got Rabbis and Wives, Rabbis' Wives on 8 books, and it was not expensive. Maybe I was lucky.
when?
Yeah,
About 4 or 5 years ago, maybe.
Oh, no.
yeah,
said-
I actually just bought it on Amazon, and there's used copies, and so with shipping is like $8, Rabbis and Wives. But I had an idea, since I think we're all like hungry now, is that and I'm just floating this, but buy copies that we can for the shul, and maybe Rabbi from your discretionary fund. We can buy some of these more expensive ones, and then we can all share it.
Great idea.
Love that. Let's do it.
Anybody else want to say anything that you noticed about Chaim Grade today, or the program? Sally.
Well, I would just like to say that I loved his writing. He painted pictures with words, and therefore it was easy to understand. So I could see all those vegetables. I could see all those people. I could see all of it. And now I am anxious to read and go in and look at it at a different level.
I as I was reading the descriptions of the fruits and vegetables, I was at the farmer's market yesterday, and it was like he was describing the farmer's market, and what's coming out now, and the freshly dug potatoes and the cauliflower, and this, it was really amazing.
It particularly makes me want to read it because I was able to go to Poland when I was living in Jerusalem. I took a 2-week trip to Poland where we didn't only go to the camps, but we also went to several of the old shtetl towns, so that used to be shtetls, and saw the remaining synagogues, or learned where Jews used to live. And to be able to hear someone's voice that kind of fills that out with words and images would be, I know there's others as well, but to hear his voice is something I'd like to do.
We have about a 2-page section that I think would be good to bring to the Torah studies, because it's about the power of Torah in directing our lives. And it's just so beautiful. It is poetry. And so I couldn't find examples of his poetry separate, but it's in all of these novels. And it's in the memoirs most emotionally. The way he felt is what he wrote.
Well, thank you so much. It was so wonderful. And I'm so glad so many of you were able to be here. And Abraham for inspiring my mother. She's been talking nonstop about this book for the past many months. So it was just a wonderful shidduch to mention it to her.
I didn't talk about it to people around here because I had these library copies and I kept extending the loan because for this talk, and I was afraid other people would want to get them, but nobody did. And so really he isn't well known enough, and we have to change that.
That's right.
Well, now you can talk about it to all of your friends there, and they can get the books, because now maybe you'll return them and they can take them from the library.
I'm going to take some pictures of some of the pages though, and I'm going to try to get my own copies.
And as long as we're all here, and David had mentioned, and maybe Abraham had too, Kaplan, there will be another Bagel U. Is that the next Bagel U coming up? Oh, yes. Okay. Yeah. So make sure you look at your e-bulletin, because we have David and Abraham presenting on Mordecai Kaplan and Reconstructionism coming up soon, and many, many other wonderful programs as well. So thank you again so much.
Thank you.
And wonderful to see you.
Well
all.
done.
Well done.
Yasher koach.
Yasher
Yay,
koach.
yasher
Very
koach.
nice, Tony.
And hey, Tony, I'm going to send you, I think I have it on electronically, the quarrel.
Thank you.
It is brilliant. And I got it through Mosaic Press.
Oh, really?
But it's available and it's so marvelous. So I'll send it to you today.
Okay.
Thank you, Tony.
Anybody finds anything, I'll borrow it from them.
Thank
Bye.
Send it to Betsy too.
Yeah. And anybody else that wants it, I'll send it.
Bye-bye.
We'll get the list from Jerry, David. I bet everyone would.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Great.
Thank you, Diana. Oh, your support was